The salt air off Chesapeake Bay hit Commander Jessica Reaper Caldwell's face as she stepped out of the unmarked sedan at the main gate of Naval Air Station Oceana. She wore faded jeans, a gray navy hoodie with no insignia, and running shoes that had seen better days. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and the only bag she carried was a worn black backpack that looked like it had been through a deployment or three. The Marine at the gate barely glanced up from his clipboard. He was young, maybe 22, with the kind of eager expression that said he'd been stationed here less than 6 months, and was still excited about checking IDs. "Morning, ma'am," he said automatically, taking her temporary base pass. He scanned it, typed something into his computer, and handed it back without making eye contact. "Administrative Services, Building 12. Visitor parking is to your left." "Thank you," Jessica replied quietly. Behind him, 2 sailors leaned against the guard shack, coffee cups in hand. One of them, a petty officer with a smirk that seemed permanently etched on his face, watched her walk through. "Another desk jockey," he muttered to his companion, just loud enough for her to hear. "Probably can't tell a Super Hornet from a cargo plane." His friend chuckled. "Give her a week. She'll either quit or get lost in the filing system." Jessica kept walking, her expression unchanged. She'd heard worse, much worse. In places where the stakes were life and death, not just bruised egos and bad coffee. What they didn't know, what nobody on this base knew yet, was that Commander Jessica Caldwell wasn't just another administrative transfer. She was Rear Admiral Jessica Caldwell, callsign Reaper, one of the youngest flag officers in naval aviation history. The woman who'd flown combat missions over 3 different theaters. The tactical genius who'd coordinated a carrier strike group through a missile engagement that should have been a disaster but became a textbook case study at the Naval War College. And as of tomorrow morning, she would be their new commanding officer. But today she was nobody. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Jessica had requested this assignment herself. When the Chief of Naval Operations had offered her command of NAS Oceana, she'd made an unusual counterproposal. Give her 1 week to observe the base undercover before her official change of command ceremony. She wanted to see the place as it really was, not the polished, sanitized version that would be presented to an arriving admiral. The CNO had been skeptical at first. "You want to what? Play undercover boss at one of our premier air stations?" "I want to understand what's really happening there, sir," she'd replied. "The inspection reports look good on paper, but the readiness metrics don't match the morale indicators. Something's broken, and I need to see it from the ground level before I can fix it." He'd approved it with one condition. Only he and 2 other people in the chain of command would know her true identity. Everyone else would believe she was exactly what her cover story said: a mid-level administrative officer being transferred in to help with logistics coordination. Now, walking across the parking lot toward the weathered concrete building that housed administrative services, Jessica took in everything with the trained eye of someone who'd spent 20 years learning to read situations others missed. The aircraft on the flight line were immaculate F/A-18 Super Hornets gleaming in the morning sun, their maintenance crews moving with practiced efficiency. That was good. Whatever problems existed here, they weren't with the flight operations or the maintainers. But the administrative buildings told a different story. Paint peeling near the door frames. Windows that looked like they hadn't been properly cleaned in months. A parking lot full of potholes that no one had bothered to repair. And the people. That was what really caught her attention. Sailors moved between buildings with their heads down, shoulders slightly hunched. There was no energy, no pride in their bearing. They looked like people who'd learned that initiative was punished and mediocrity was rewarded. Jessica pulled open the door to Building 12 and stepped into a lobby that smelled like old coffee and copy machine toner. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, one of them flickering in an irregular rhythm that would drive anyone crazy after a few hours. A dusty artificial plant sat in the corner, its fake leaves covered in a layer of grime that suggested no one had touched it in years. The reception desk was empty except for a bell with a faded sign that read, "Ring for service." She rang it once, then waited, and waited. After 3 full minutes, a door behind the desk finally opened, and a petty officer emerged, looking irritated at being disturbed. His uniform was technically within regulations, but just barely, shirt untucked slightly on one side, name tag crooked, ribbons that looked like they'd been pinned on in a hurry. "Yeah?" he said, not bothering with rank or courtesy. Jessica handed him her orders. "Commander Caldwell. Reporting as directed. Administrative services." He took the papers without looking at her face, scanned them with obvious disinterest, and tossed them on the desk. "Caldwell. Right. They said someone new was coming." He picked up a phone and dialed a 3-digit extension. "Lieutenant Vance? Yeah, your new admin officer is here. You want me to send her up or?" "Uh-huh. Yeah, okay." He hung up and jerked his thumb toward a stairwell. "3rd floor. Room 317. Lieutenant Vance will get you situated." "Thank you," Jessica said. He'd already turned away, disappearing back through the door without another word. Jessica climbed the stairs slowly, taking note of everything. Scuff marks on the walls that hadn't been painted over. A broken handrail that had been fixed with duct tape. A bulletin board displaying safety notices that were 6 months out of date. This wasn't just neglect. This was a command climate where nobody cared anymore. Room 317 had a nameplate outside. Lt. Marcus Vance, Administrative Services Division Officer. She knocked twice. "Come in," a voice called. The office was small and cluttered, dominated by a government-issue desk buried under stacks of files, binders, and loose papers that looked like they'd been reproducing when no one was watching. Behind the desk sat Lieutenant Marcus Vance, a man in his early 30s, with the tired eyes of someone who'd been fighting bureaucracy so long he'd forgotten what victory looked like. He stood when she entered. At least he had that much courtesy, and extended his hand. "Commander Caldwell. Marcus Vance. Welcome to the BOD, administrative black hole of NAS Oceana." She shook his hand. His grip was firm but weary. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'm looking forward to getting oriented." Vance laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Oriented? Right. Well, let me give you the grand tour." He gestured around the cramped office. "This is where paperwork comes to die. We handle personnel actions, supply requisitions, facility maintenance requests, and about 40 other random tasks that nobody else wants to deal with. We're understaffed, under-resourced, and underappreciated." He sat back down and waved her toward a chair piled with folders. She moved them to the floor and took a seat. "I'm going to be straight with you, ma'am," Vance continued. "This division is a dumping ground. They send people here who either screwed up somewhere else or who they don't know what to do with. Half my staff are counting the days until they can transfer out, and the other half have given up entirely. The command treats us like we're invisible until something goes wrong, then suddenly we're the reason the whole base isn't functioning perfectly." Jessica kept her expression neutral, but inside she was already making notes. This kind of demoralization didn't happen overnight. It was the result of sustained poor leadership and a toxic command climate. "What's the biggest challenge you're facing right now?" she asked. Vance looked at her like she'd just asked him to pick his least favorite of his children. "Where do I start? We're 6 weeks behind on personnel evaluations. The supply system is so backed up that squadrons are cannibalizing parts from their own aircraft just to keep others flying. Facility maintenance requests go into a black hole. I've got work orders from 8 months ago that haven't even been acknowledged. And morale?" He shook his head. "Morale is somewhere below the Marianas Trench." "What does the CO say about all this?" Vance's expression hardened slightly. "Captain Hendricks is focused on other priorities. Flight operations, mainly. As long as the jets are flying and we pass our inspections, he considers everything else to be internal management issues that we should handle ourselves." Translation: The commanding officer didn't care about anything that wasn't directly related to his own career advancement. "And the XO?" Jessica asked. "Commander Richter is." Vance chose his words carefully. "He's very concerned with protocol and proper procedure. Everything has to go through the right channels, in the right order with the right paperwork. Which would be fine if the channels actually worked, but they don't, so nothing ever gets done." Jessica had seen this pattern before. A CO who was checked out and an XO who was more concerned with covering his own ass than actually leading. It was a recipe for organizational dysfunction. "Well," she said, keeping her tone light and professional, "I'm here to help however I can. What would you like me to start with?" Vance pulled a load, thick binder from his desk and dropped it in front of her with a heavy thud. "Personnel Action Backlog. These are evaluation reports that should have been submitted weeks ago. They're holding up promotions, transfers, and award recommendations for about 60 sailors. I need someone to review them, make sure they're complete and properly formatted, and then route them through the approval chain." Jessica opened the binder and began flipping through the pages. Within 30 seconds, she'd spotted at least 5 errors that would cause the documents to be rejected when they reached boopers. Incorrect date formats, missing signature blocks, evaluation codes that didn't match the written comments. She'd written hundreds of these evaluations during her career. She'd also served on promotion boards and knew exactly what they looked for. These evaluations weren't just wrong, they were going to hurt the careers of the sailors they were supposed to help. But she couldn't say any of that. Not yet. Commander Jessica Caldwell, administrative transfer, wouldn't have that kind of expertise. "I'll get started on these right away," she said instead. Vance looked relieved. "Great. Your desk is in the bullpen through that door, second cubicle on the left. Computer login information is in this packet. If you have questions, just try to figure it out on your own first. Everyone here is pretty much drowning in their own work." Jessica took the packet and stood. "Understood. Thank you, Lieutenant." As she reached the door, Vance called after her. "Hey, Commander. Word of advice. Keep your head down, don't make waves, and don't expect anyone to thank you for working hard. That's just how things work around here." She nodded and stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her. For a long moment, she stood there, anger and sadness warring in her chest. This wasn't what the Navy was supposed to be. This wasn't what she dedicated her life to serving. But anger and sadness wouldn't fix it. Only action would. Jessica Caldwell Reaper had 1 week to understand this broken system before she would have the authority to change it. And she was going to use every minute of it. The bullpen was exactly what Jessica expected. A large room divided into gray cubicles, each one barely big enough for a desk, a computer, and a filing cabinet. The walls were that particular shade of institutional beige that seemed designed to drain the will to live from anyone who looked at it for too long. About a dozen people worked in the space, hunched over their keyboards or talking quietly on phones. The atmosphere was thick, with the kind of resigned frustration that came from doing work no one valued. Jessica found her assigned cubicle second on the left, just as Vance had said, and set down her backpack. The desk was standard government issue, metal and laminate, with a few scratches and coffee rings that suggested several previous occupants. The computer was at least 5 years old. The kind that took 3 minutes to boot up and made ominous whirring sounds when you asked it to do too much at once. She logged in using the credentials from her packet and pulled up the personnel evaluation system. While she waited for it to load predictably, slowly, she became aware of voices from the cubicle behind her. "Did you see the new admin officer?" A woman's voice asked, pitched just low enough to sound discreet but still clearly audible. "Yeah. Another ring knocker who probably thinks she's going to save us all." A male voice replied with obvious sarcasm. "Give her 2 weeks. She'll either figure out that nothing matters here and stop trying, or she'll transfer out like the last 3. "I don't know," the woman said. "She looks pretty young. Probably got pushed into admin because she couldn't hack it in a real job." Jessica's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her eyes on her screen. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times in her career. The assumption that because she was relatively young and female, she must not be competent. That she'd gotten where she was through luck or favoritism rather than skill and dedication. It had bothered her early in her career. Now it just made her more determined. The male voice continued. Did you notice she doesn't have any warfare pins? No surface warfare. No aviation. Just a plain uniform. Probably spent her whole career behind a desk pushing papers. If he'd looked more carefully, if any of them had, they would have noticed the slight discoloration on her uniform shirt where pins had been removed. The small indentations where a naval aviator badge had been pinned for 20 years, along with other insignia she couldn't wear while maintaining her cover. But people saw what they expected to see. And they expected to see another mediocre admin officer, so that's what they saw. Jessica opened the binder of evaluation reports and began reviewing the first one. As she'd suspected from her quick glance in Vance's office, it was a mess. The reporting senior had clearly just copied boilerplate language from an old template without bothering to customize it for the actual sailor being evaluated. The result was generic and unhelpful. The kind of evaluation that would neither help nor hurt someone's career, but would certainly waste everyone's time. She made careful notes on a separate pad, documenting the issues and how to fix them. But she didn't correct anything yet. Commander Caldwell, anonymous admin officer, wouldn't have the expertise to spot these problems immediately. After about an hour of quiet work, a shadow fell across her desk. She looked up to find a tall lieutenant commander standing at the entrance to her cubicle. Arms crossed. Expression somewhere between annoyed and suspicious. His name tag read Taurus. He had sharp features, dark eyes, and the bearing of someone who decided that his seniority entitled him to treat anyone junior with barely concealed contempt. "You're the new admin officer," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Commander Caldwell. "Torres. I'm the Operations Department Head Liaison to Admin Services." He said it like he was announcing his position as royalty. "I need you to expedite some evaluation reports for my people. They're stuck in your backlog. And I've got sailors who can't transfer until these are processed." Jessica recognized the type immediately. An officer who thought that being demanding and aggressive was the same thing as being an effective leader. The kind who made everyone around him miserable and called it high standards. "I just started reviewing the backlog this morning, sir," she said calmly. "If you can give me the names of the sailors you're concerned about, I'll prioritize their evaluations." Torres frowned, clearly not used to anyone responding to his demands with anything other than immediate compliance. "I shouldn't have to prioritize anything. Your job is to process these things in a timely manner. The fact that there's a backlog at all is evidence of incompetence in this division." Jessica felt the familiar tingle of anger at the base of her skull, but she kept her voice level. "I understand your frustration, sir. I'm working to address the backlog as quickly as possible." "Work faster," Torres snapped. "I've got a chief who's supposed to transfer in 3 weeks, and if his eval isn't done, he's going to miss his window. That's unacceptable." "I'll make sure it's prioritized," Jessica replied. Torres leaned forward slightly, invading her personal space in a move clearly designed to intimidate. "Let me be clear, Commander. I don't know what your last command was like, or what you think this job is going to be. But around here, operations is priority 1. When I need something from admin, I expect it to be done immediately. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Immediately. Do we understand each other?" Jessica met his gaze without flinching. She'd stared down enemy pilots at Mach 1.5, had made life and death decisions while under fire, had commanded hundreds of sailors in combat. This petty tyrant's attempt at intimidation was almost laughable. But Commander Caldwell, anonymous admin officer, would probably be intimidated. So she let her eyes drop slightly and nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand." Torres straightened, apparently satisfied that he'd successfully asserted his dominance. "Good. I'll check back tomorrow to see what progress you've made." He turned and walked away without another word. Jessica watched him go, then returned to her work. Around her, the bullpen had gone completely silent. Everyone had heard the exchange. She could feel their eyes on her, wondering how she'd react. She didn't react at all. She just kept working. But inside, she was adding Lieutenant Commander Torres to a growing list of people who were about to have a very different experience of naval command once she revealed her true identity. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of administrative tedium and subtle observations. Jessica worked through the evaluation reports with methodical care, documenting problems, but not yet fixing them. She wanted to understand the full scope of the dysfunction before she started making changes. Around 1,130, the bullpen began to empty as people headed to lunch. Jessica decided to join them, both because she was hungry and because she wanted to observe more of the base's culture and climate. The base galley was a large, utilitarian space that smelled like institutional food and floor cleaner. Jessica went through the line, selected a sandwich and a coffee, and found a seat at a table near the window where she could watch and listen. The table filled up quickly with other junior officers and senior enlisted personnel. Most of them ignored her completely, absorbed in their own conversations and concerns. "Can't believe they're making us do another readiness inspection," a lieutenant was saying to his companion. "We just had one 3 months ago. What's the point? Everyone knows we're going to pass, because we'll spend 2 weeks preparing and make everything look good, then go back to normal once the inspectors leave. That's how it always works," his friend replied. "Command doesn't care about actual readiness. They care about inspection readiness. There's a difference." A chief petty officer at the next table was having a similar conversation with his team. "I've been trying to get approval for that new diagnostic equipment for 6 months. Keep getting told the budget's tight and we need to prioritize mission-critical items. Meanwhile, we're jury-rigging repairs with equipment that should have been replaced 5 years ago. Did you talk to the CO about it?" one of his sailors asked. The chief snorted. "I tried. Got about 30 seconds of his time before he told me to work it out with the supply officer, who told me to submit a priority requisition, which I did 5 times. And it keeps getting kicked back for insufficient justification." Jessica listened to these conversations with growing concern. This wasn't just one division or one department having problems. This was systemic failure at multiple levels, a complete breakdown in the feedback loops that were supposed to ensure problems got identified and addressed. She was so absorbed in listening that she didn't notice someone approaching her table until a shadow fell across her tray. "Mind if I sit?" Jessica looked up to find a woman in her mid-40s, wearing khakis with Master Chief Petty Officer anchors on her collar. Her name tag read Sullivan. She had sharp eyes, gray hair cut in a no-nonsense style, and the bearing of someone who'd seen everything the Navy had to offer and wasn't impressed by any of it. "Please," Jessica said, gesturing to the empty seat. Master Chief Sullivan sat down with her lunch tray and studied Jessica for a moment before speaking. "You're the new admin, Officer Caldwell, right?" "That's right, Master Chief. I heard Torres gave you a warm welcome this morning." There was a hint of dry humor in her voice. Jessica smiled slightly. "News travels fast. On a base this size. Always." Sullivan took a bite of her sandwich, chewed thoughtfully, then continued. "Torres is an ass. Always has been. Probably always will be. But he's got friends in high places, so nothing ever gets done about it." "I gathered that," Jessica replied carefully. Sullivan leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Word of advice, ma'am. Keep your head down, do your job, and don't try to fix things. People who try to fix things around here either get crushed by the system or they burn out and transfer. The ones who survive are the ones who accept that this is just how things are and learn to work within it." Jessica recognized the voice of experience, speaking someone who'd probably tried to make changes herself at some point and been defeated by institutional inertia. "That's the second time today someone's given me that advice," Jessica said. "Then maybe you should take it," Sullivan replied. But there was something in her eyes, a spark of something that might have been hope, Or maybe just curiosity. Though I'll admit, there's a part of me that wishes someone would come in here and shake things up. This place used to be a good command. People were proud to serve here. Now, she shook her head. Now, it's just a place to collect a paycheck and count the days until retirement. Jessica was about to respond when a commotion at the entrance to the galley drew everyone's attention. Captain Hendricks had arrived. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with silver hair and a uniform that looked like it had been professionally pressed 5 minutes ago. He moved through the galley with the air of someone who expected everyone to get out of his way. And they did. Sailors and officers alike stood up and came to attention as he passed. He acknowledged no one. Didn't make eye contact, didn't nod, didn't speak. He just walked straight through to a private dining area reserved for senior officers and disappeared behind a closed door. The entire interaction, if you could call it that, lasted less than 30 seconds. But in those 30 seconds, Jessica learned everything she needed to know about Captain Hendricks's leadership style. He didn't see the people under his command as human beings. He saw them as pieces of equipment that were supposed to function properly and stay out of his way. Master Chief Sullivan watched the captain disappear, then turned back to Jessica with a sardonic smile. "And that," she said quietly, "is why nothing ever changes around here." Jessica spent the afternoon working through more of the evaluation backlog, but her mind was already analyzing the deeper problems she'd observed. The dysfunction at NAS Oceana wasn't just about administrative inefficiency, it was about a complete failure of leadership at the highest levels. Around 1,600, she decided to take a walk around the base. Officially, she told Lieutenant Vance she wanted to familiarize herself with the layout and get a sense of where different departments were located. In reality, she wanted to see more of how the base operated when senior leadership wasn't watching. She started with the maintenance hangars, where the real work of keeping aircraft combat ready happened. These massive buildings housed teams of dedicated maintainers who worked brutal hours to ensure that every jet was safe to fly and ready for mission. Jessica watched from a distance as a team worked on an F/A-18's engine. Their movements were efficient and practiced, but she noticed something that made her stop and pay closer attention. The chief in charge of the team was pointing at something in the engine compartment, clearly explaining a technical issue to a younger sailor. But instead of using proper terminology and following established procedures, he was teaching a workaround, a quick fix that would get the aircraft flying but wouldn't address the underlying problem. It was the kind of shortcut that happened when people were under too much pressure and didn't have the resources they needed to do the job right. In the short term, it worked. In the long term, it created safety risks and training problems that compounded over time. Jessica made a mental note to review maintenance procedures and resource allocation for the aviation squadrons. She continued her walk, heading toward the communications building. As she approached, she passed two sailors who were clearly in the middle of a heated discussion. "Telling you, the system's going to crash during the next drill," one of them was saying urgently. "I've been warning people for months, but nobody listens." "Did you submit a trouble ticket?" his companion asked. "Of course I submitted a trouble ticket. I submitted 6 of them. They all got closed as working as designed or no action required." "Then, what do you want me to do about it?" The first sailor shook his head in frustration. "I don't know. I just know that when the system fails and we can't communicate during an emergency, everyone's going to act surprised and want to know why nobody warned them. And I'll be sitting there with 6 closed trouble tickets saying I did warn you, but nobody wanted to listen." Jessica filed that away as well. Communication system vulnerabilities were serious, and if someone had been raising red flags for months without being heard, that was a leadership failure that needed immediate attention. By the time she returned to the admin building, it was nearly 1,700. Most of the bullpen had already cleared out. Military service might technically be a 24/7 commitment, but in garrison, people kept to a relatively predictable schedule. Lieutenant Vance was still in his office, looking more exhausted than he had that morning. Jessica knocked on his door frame. "Come in," he said without looking up from whatever he was reading. "I'm heading out for the day, sir. Wanted to let you know I made progress on about 15 of the evaluation reports. They should be ready for your review tomorrow." Now Vance did look up, surprise evident on his face. 15? In one day? Jessica shrugged slightly. They mostly needed formatting corrections, and some missing information filled in. Nothing major. Vance stood and walked over to take the reports from her. He flipped through the first few, his expression growing more surprised with each page. These are actually good," he said slowly. "I mean, they're really good. Better than most of the evals I see come through here." He looked at her with new interest. "Where did you say your last command was?" Jessica felt a small flutter of concern. She needed to be careful not to reveal too much expertise too quickly. "I've done my share of admin work over the years," she said vaguely. "You pick up the patterns after a while." Vance nodded slowly, but she could see him reassessing her. "Well, whatever you picked up, keep doing it. This is the best work I've seen from admin in. Actually, I'm not sure I've ever seen work this good from this division." "Happy to help, sir." As she turned to leave, Vance called after her. "Hey, Caldwell? Thanks. I mean it. It's nice to have someone around who actually seems to care about doing the job right." Jessica smiled. "See you tomorrow, Lieutenant." She left the admin building and walked back toward the parking lot where she'd left her car that morning. The sun was starting to set over the bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her why she loved being stationed near the water. As she walked, she passed the squadron-ready rooms where pilots gathered to brief and debrief their flights. Through one window, she could see a group of junior aviators clustered around a conference table, clearly engaged in some kind of tactical discussion. Jessica paused, unable to resist watching for a moment. These were her people aviators, the ones who strapped into fighter jets and launched into the sky with nothing but their training, their reflexes, and their courage between them and disaster. One of the pilots was gesturing animatedly, clearly describing some maneuver. Even from outside, Jessica could tell he was explaining it wrong, conflating two different tactics in a way that would get you killed in a real engagement. The senior officer supervising the brief didn't correct him, just nodded and moved on. Jessica's hands clenched involuntarily. Bad training was dangerous training. If these pilots were learning incorrect tactics, they would carry those mistakes with them into combat. And in combat, mistakes got people killed. But there was nothing she could do about it. Not yet. Not as Commander Caldwell, anonymous admin officer, who supposedly had no aviation background. She forced herself to turn away and continue to her car. Tomorrow was day 2 of 7. She had 5 more days to observe, to document, to understand the full scope of the problems facing this command. And then, on day 7, she would put on her Admiral stars and show these sailors what real leadership looked like. But first, she had to survive 6 more days of being invisible, dismissed, and underestimated. For someone who'd commanded carrier strike groups and made million-dollar tactical decisions in fractions of a second, it should have been easy. Instead, it was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. Day 3 started like the previous 2, Jessica arriving at the gate in her civilian clothes, being waved through with barely a glance, walking into the admin building to face another day of bureaucratic dysfunction and casual dismissal. But she could feel something different in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Lieutenant Vance was already in his office when she arrived at 0730 on the phone, and looking more stressed than usual. Through his open door, she could hear fragments of the conversation. "Understand that, but we don't have the personnel to." "Yes, sir. I know the inspection is in 2 days." But he saw her standing in the doorway and waved her in urgently while continuing his conversation. "Yes, sir. We'll make it work. Somehow." "Yes, sir." He hung up and immediately dropped his head into his hands. "Damn it, sir," Jessica asked carefully. Vance looked up at her with the expression of a man who'd just been told to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon. That was Commander Richter. "The XO. Apparently, we have a surprise logistics compliance inspection starting tomorrow instead of next week." which means every single supply record, maintenance request, and personnel file needs to be audit-ready by 0800 tomorrow morning. Jessica felt her stomach tighten. She knew what a logistics compliance inspection entailed. It was one of the most comprehensive and demanding inspections a command could face. Inspectors would review every aspect of supply chain management, from requisition procedures to inventory accuracy, to documentation standards. And from what she'd seen over the past 2 days, NAS Oceana was nowhere near ready. "How much preparation have we done?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Basically none," Vance admitted. "The inspection was supposed to be next week, so we were planning to start our prep cycle tomorrow. Now tomorrow is the inspection, which means we have roughly," he checked his watch, "23 hours to get 3 weeks of work done. What do you need from me?" Vance pulled up a document on his computer and turned the screen toward her. It was a checklist of required documentation and compliance items. The list was easily 3 pages long, and almost nothing was marked as complete. "I need you to pull together all the outstanding supply requisitions from the past 6 months and verify that they're properly documented in the system. That's probably going to be at least 200 individual records that need to be reviewed, corrected if necessary, and validated." Jessica scanned the list quickly. 200 records in 23 hours, while also maintaining normal daily operations. It was technically possible, but only if everything went perfectly. Which, based on her experience here, nothing ever did. "I'll get started right away," she said. "Thank you." Vance turned back to his computer, already pulling up another section of the checklist. "And Caldwell? I know I said to keep your head down and not make waves, but if you have any ideas about how to make this work, now would be a really good time to share them." Jessica paused in the doorway. This was a decision point. She could continue playing the role of anonymous admin officer, doing her assigned task competently but not offering any real leadership. Or she could start showing glimpses of her actual capability and risk, drawing attention to herself. But watching this command crash and burn on an inspection because of poor planning and inadequate leadership went against everything she believed in. "Sir, can I see the full inspection checklist?" Vance sent the file to her computer. "Why?" "Because before we start randomly checking boxes, we need to understand which items are actually going to be inspected first and which ones we can address later if we run out of time. Not everything on this list is equally important." Vance looked at her with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "You've been through one of these before?" "A few times," Jessica said carefully. Which was true, she'd been through dozens of them, though usually from the commanding officer's chair rather than the administrative trenches. She returned to her desk and pulled up the full inspection documentation. Her trained eye immediately recognized the pattern. These inspections always followed a standard sequence, starting with the most critical supply chain elements and working down to secondary and tertiary items. The problem was that Lieutenant Vance and his team were trying to prepare everything simultaneously, which meant they'd probably end up with nothing completely ready. What they needed was a prioritization strategy based on what would actually be inspected first. Jessica spent the next hour creating a prioritized action plan, breaking down the inspection requirements into 3 tiers. Critical items that had to be perfect, important items that needed to be good enough, and lower priority items that could be addressed if time permitted. Then she did something that Commander Caldwell, anonymous admin officer, probably shouldn't have been able to do. She drafted a detailed execution plan with specific task assignments, timelines, and quality checkpoints, the kind of operational planning that normally came from someone with years of command experience. She walked back to Vance's office and handed him the document. He read it slowly, his expression changing from confused to surprised to something approaching awe. "This is Caldwell. This is a complete inspection response plan. Where did you learn to do this?" Jessica kept her voice casual. "I've worked enough inspections to see the patterns. This is just organizing what we already know into a logical sequence." Vance stared at her for a long moment. clearly trying to reconcile the unassuming admin officer who'd arrived 3 days ago with the person who'd just handed him a graduate-level operational plan. "Can you help me implement this?" he asked finally. "That's why I'm here, sir." By noon, the admin bullpen had transformed from a sleepy bureaucratic backwater into something resembling a command center. Jessica had organized the staff into 3 teams, each focusing on a different tier of the inspection checklist. She'd set up a central tracking board where progress could be monitored in real time, and she'd instituted regular check-ins to ensure nothing was falling through the cracks. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. Lieutenant Commander Torres showed up around 1,300, clearly having heard that something unusual was happening in admin. "What's all this?" he demanded, looking at the tracking board with obvious suspicion. Vance, who'd been running himself ragged all morning trying to keep up with the accelerated schedule, looked up from his desk. "Inspection prep, sir. The logistics compliance inspection got moved up." "I know that," Torres snapped. "What I want to know is why admin suddenly looks like it has its act together. This isn't how things normally work around here." Before Vance could respond, Torres turned his attention to Jessica, who was at the tracking board updating status on several supply records. "Caldwell, what's your role in all this?" Jessica turned to face him, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm helping coordinate the inspection preparation, sir." "Coordinate?" Torres said the word like it tasted bad. "That's interesting. Because last time I checked, you were a mid-grade admin officer who just arrived here 3 days ago. Now suddenly, you're running some kind of operations center and reorganizing how this whole division works?" The bullpen had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching to see how this confrontation would play out. Jessica chose her words carefully. Lieutenant Vance asked for suggestions on how to manage the inspection timeline. "Sir, I provided a framework based on standard prioritization principles. That's all." "That's all," Torres repeated mockingly. He walked over to the tracking board and examined it more closely. "This isn't some basic prioritization. This is an operational command structure. The kind of thing that requires actual leadership experience and tactical planning capability." He turned back to her. Eyes narrowed. "So, I'm going to ask you again. Commander Caldwell, where exactly did you learn to do this?" Jessica felt the weight of the moment. Torres was smart enough to recognize that something didn't add up. If she deflected too much, he'd keep pushing. If she revealed too much, her cover could be compromised. "I've had good mentors over the years, sir," she said evenly. "And I've always been interested in operational planning, even if that hasn't been my primary billet." Torres stepped closer, invading her personal space again the way he had on day 1. But this time there was something different in his expression, not just intimidation, but genuine suspicion. "I don't believe you," he said flatly. "Nobody just picks up command-level operational planning from good mentors. This takes years of experience in actual leadership positions. So either you're lying about your background, or, Lieutenant Commander Torres." The voice came from the doorway, sharp and authoritative. Everyone turned to see Master Chief Sullivan standing there, arms crossed, expression stern. "Master Chief," Torres acknowledged, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, with respect, Commander Caldwell is trying to help this division get ready for an inspection that will reflect on the entire command. Maybe instead of interrogating her about where she learned to make a tracking board, we should focus on making sure we pass the inspection tomorrow." Torres's jaw tightened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by enlisted personnel, even senior ones. But Sullivan was a Master Chief with 25 years of service, and even someone as arrogant as Torres knew better than to start a fight with her in front of junior personnel. "Fine," he said coldly. "But I'm going to be watching you, Caldwell. Something doesn't add up here, and I'm going to figure out what it is." He turned and walked out of the bullpen, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Master Chief Sullivan walked over to Jessica and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "You're not just an admin officer, are you?" Jessica met her eyes. "Master Chief." "Don't worry, ma'am. I don't know who you really are. and I'm not going to ask. But I've been in the Navy long enough to recognize real leadership when I see it. And whatever you're doing here, I hope you keep doing it." She walked away before Jessica could respond. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of focused activity. Jessica worked alongside the admin staff, reviewing supply records, correcting documentation errors, and ensuring that every critical item on the inspection checklist was addressed. Around 1700, she was deep in a particularly complicated requisition record when she heard a commotion near the entrance to the bullpen. "Need to speak with whoever's in charge of this inspection prep," a voice was saying, urgently. Jessica looked up to see a chief petty officer from the Aviation Maintenance Department, standing in the doorway, looking stressed and agitated. Lieutenant Vance emerged from his office. "I'm the division officer." "What's the problem, Chief?" "Sir, I just got word that the inspectors are specifically going to review our aircraft parts inventory as part of the supply chain audit. But our inventory records are a disaster. We've got parts that are in the system but not on the shelves, parts on the shelves that aren't in the system, and about 36 discrepancies that we've been meaning to resolve but haven't had time." Vance's face went pale. Aircraft parts inventory was one of the most critical aspects of the logistics inspection. If the records didn't match reality, the command would fail that section automatically. And a failure in that section could trigger a much more comprehensive investigation. "How bad is it?" Vance asked. "Bad enough that if the inspectors spot check our inventory tomorrow, we're going to have some very uncomfortable conversations about why we can't account for about $200,000 worth of aircraft components." The number hit the room like a physical blow. $200,000 in unaccounted for parts wasn't just an inspection failure. It was potentially evidence of theft, negligence, or catastrophic systems failure. Any of those would result in serious consequences for the command leadership. Vance looked like he was about to be sick. "We can't possibly inventory the entire aviation parts warehouse before tomorrow morning. It would take days." "I know, sir. That's why I'm here. To warn you that we're probably screwed." Jessica stood up from her desk. She'd been listening to the entire exchange, and her mind was already working through the problem. "Chief, what's your name?" she asked. The chief turned to her. "Chief Warrant Officer Blake, ma'am. I run the aviation supply warehouse." "Chief Blake, the discrepancies you're talking about, are they primarily data entry errors, physical inventory mistakes, or systemic tracking failures?" Blake looked surprised by the specificity of the question. "Mostly data entry errors and tracking failures, ma'am. We've been trying to transition to a new inventory management system, but the training was inadequate, and we've had personnel turnover. So things got entered incorrectly or not entered at all." Jessica's mind was racing. She knew the aviation supply system intimately. She'd dealt with it from the command level for years. The new inventory management system Blake was referring to was notoriously difficult to use, but it had specific audit functions that could identify discrepancies much faster than manual inventory. "If we could isolate the highest value discrepancies and resolve just those, would that be enough to satisfy the inspection?" she asked. Blake considered. "Maybe. If we could show that we know where the big-ticket items are and have a plan to resolve the smaller discrepancies, that might be enough to pass. But we'd need to identify which items to focus on, and that still requires going through the records." "I can do that," Jessica said. Vance looked at her sharply. "Caldwell, do you know the aviation supply system?" This was another decision point. If she claimed expertise in the aviation supply system, it would raise even more questions about her background. But if she didn't help, the command was going to fail a critical inspection through no fault of the sailors who were actually doing the work. "I've worked with it before," she said carefully. "Enough to know where the audit functions are and how to run the analysis." "Then get on it," Vance said. "Chief Blake, give Commander Caldwell access to your system and any information she needs. We've got," he checked his watch, "about 16 hours until the inspectors arrive. If we're going to fix this, it has to be now. By 2000 hours, Jessica had been working non-stop for over 12 hours. She'd consumed more bad coffee than was probably healthy, and her eyes were starting to burn from staring at computer screens. But she was making progress. The Aviation Supply Systems Audit Function had identified 237 discrepancies between physical inventory and database records. Of those, 32 involved high-value items components worth more than $5,000 each that represented the bulk of the unaccounted-for dollar value. Jessica had created a prioritized investigation plan, starting with the most likely sources of error: recent transfers between storage locations, items that had been issued to aircraft but not properly documented, and parts that had been returned from maintenance but not correctly logged back into inventory. Chief Blake had been working alongside her, physically checking storage locations while she traced records. Together, they'd already resolved 18 of the 32 high-value discrepancies. The remaining 14 would require more work, but they were on track to have answers before the inspectors arrived. Around 2100, Blake stepped away to check another storage location, leaving Jessica alone in the small office they'd been using as their working space. She was so focused on tracing a particularly complex transaction history that she didn't hear someone enter until a voice spoke behind her. "That's the transaction reversal code for an emergency maintenance pull." Jessica spun in her chair to find a lieutenant standing in the doorway. He was probably in his late 20s, with the lean build of a runner and the confident bearing of someone who knew his job well. His name tag read Morrison, and he wore the gold wings of a naval aviator. "I'm sorry?" Jessica said. Morrison stepped into the office and gestured at her screen. "The code you're looking at, BMR 7743. That's what gets entered when a part gets pulled from inventory for emergency maintenance on an aircraft that's grounded. Usually means the part that was supposed to be in the jet failed during pre-flight, so they had to grab a replacement from the warehouse." Jessica looked at the screen, then back at Morrison. "You're familiar with the supply system?" "I'm the Assistant Maintenance Officer for VFA 106, he explained. "Part of my job is coordinating parts pulls with the warehouse. I recognize most of the transaction codes." He paused, studying her with open curiosity. "But I'm surprised you don't. Most admin officers have no idea how the aviation supply system actually works." There was no hostility in his tone, just genuine puzzlement. Jessica chose her words carefully. "I'm helping Chief Blake resolve some inventory discrepancies before the inspection tomorrow. Learning as I go." Morrison nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Number 1, 2. Right. Learning as you go. Is that why you created a complete database reconciliation protocol that would normally require specialized training in aviation logistics?" He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. It was the tracking board she'd set up in the admin bullpen, specifically the section dealing with aviation supply issues. "Master Chief Sullivan sent this to a few of us, asking if we could provide support for the inspection prep," Morrison explained. "When I saw this, I had to come see who put it together. Because this isn't just good, it's better than what our own squadron supply officers would have created." Jessica felt the walls closing in slightly. First, Torres had been suspicious, then Master Chief Sullivan had noticed something was off, and now Morrison was directly questioning her expertise level. "I appreciate the compliment, Lieutenant," she said carefully. "But right now I really need to get back to resolving these discrepancies." Morrison held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Of course. I'm not trying to interfere. Actually, I came to help. I brought 3 of my best maintenance guys with me. They know the warehouse better than anyone, and if you tell them what you need found, they'll find it." The offer was generous and practical, exactly what they needed to finish the job before morning. But Jessica could see in Morrison's eyes that his help came with unspoken questions. "Thank you, Lieutenant. That would be very helpful." Morrison called in his team, and for the next 2 hours, the small group worked with focused intensity. The maintenance sailors were indeed experts in their domain, navigating the labyrinthine warehouse with ease and locating parts that had been misplaced or incorrectly stored. Around 2,300, they'd resolved all but 3 of the high-value discrepancies. The remaining items would require contacting other squadrons to trace transfer records, but they had enough documentation to satisfy the inspectors and demonstrate that the discrepancies were administrative errors rather than missing inventory. Chief Blake looked ready to collapse from relief and exhaustion. "Commander Caldwell, I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't stepped in, we'd be facing a disaster tomorrow morning." "It was a team effort, Chief," Jessica replied. "Your people did the real work." "No, ma'am," Blake said firmly. "You organized the effort, identified the priorities, and created a system that actually works. That's leadership." Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. Now he spoke up. "Commander, can I ask you something?" Jessica tensed slightly. "Of course. Where did you learn aviation logistics?" "Because I've worked with supply officers, logistics specialists, and aviation maintenance experts, and very few of them could have done what you just did. The way you navigated that system, the codes you used, the shortcuts you knew, that's not something you pick up from a manual." The room had grown very quiet. Everyone was watching to see how she'd answer. Jessica met Morrison's eyes and made a decision. She couldn't reveal her true identity yet, the timing wasn't right, and she still had more to learn about the command. But she could give him enough truth to be honest without compromising her mission. "I've spent time around aviation logistics," she said carefully. "More time than my current billet might suggest. And I've always believed that if you're going to support the mission, you need to understand it deeply enough to solve problems when they arise." It was the truth, just not the whole truth. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough, ma'am. But whoever you learned from, they taught you well." He called his team together, and they prepared to leave. At the door, he paused and turned back. "Commander? One more thing. That tracking board you set up, the way it's organized, the prioritization structure, the execution timeline, I've seen that style before. It's almost exactly like the operational planning frameworks they teach at the Naval War College." Jessica's heart rate kicked up slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. "I've read some of the published case studies from there. Interesting material." "Yeah," Morrison said softly. "Interesting." He didn't sound convinced, but he didn't push further. "Good luck with the inspection tomorrow, ma'am. Something tells me you won't need it." After Morrison and his team left, Jessica found herself alone in the office with Chief Blake, who was organizing the documentation they'd created into binders for the inspection team. "Ma'am, can I say something?" Blake asked. "Of course, Chief. I don't know what your story is, and I'm not asking. But I've been doing this job for 15 years. And I've never seen anyone walk into an aviation supply crisis and solve it the way you just did. So whoever you are, whatever you're really doing here, thank you." Jessica felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she'd joined the Navy. Why she'd stayed despite all the challenges and frustrations. Because, when it really mattered, when people needed help, she could make a difference. "Just doing my job, Chief." Blake smiled. "If that's just you doing your job, ma'am, I'd hate to see what happens when you really try." Jessica finally left the base around midnight, exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. The inspection preparation was in good shape, and she'd helped prevent what could have been a catastrophic failure in the aviation logistics portion of the audit. But as she drove back to the temporary housing she'd been assigned, she couldn't shake the feeling that her cover was beginning to crack. Torres was suspicious. Master Chief Sullivan had essentially figured out that she wasn't really just an admin officer, and Morrison had noticed details about her expertise that didn't match her supposed background. She had 4 more days before the change of command ceremony. 4 more days to maintain her cover while learning everything she could about the real state of affairs at NASA Oceana. Could she make it that long without being exposed? She didn't know. But she was committed to trying. Day 4 started at 0600 when Jessica's phone rang with an urgent call from Lieutenant Vance. Caldwell. The inspectors arrived early. They're starting the supply chain audit now. At 0630 instead of 0800. Can you get here immediately? Jessica was already pulling on her uniform. On my way, sir. 20 minutes. She made it in 15, arriving at the admin building to find it buzzing with activity. The inspection team consisted of 4 senior officers and 6 specialists, all wearing the serious expressions of people who knew their job was to find problems. Lieutenant Vance looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. They're starting with the aviation supply warehouse. Chief Blake is giving them the initial briefing now. Did you give them the reconciliation documentation we prepared? Yes, but they want to do their own spot checks. They've already identified 3 items from the high-value list and are physically verifying their location right now. Jessica and Vance hurried to the warehouse, where they found Chief Blake walking the inspection team through the storage areas. The lead inspector, a captain with sharp eyes and a reputation for being thorough but fair, was examining a binder of documentation while his team physically located parts and verified serial numbers. Chief Blake, the captain said, looking up from his notes. Your documentation indicates that you had 32 high-value discrepancies as of yesterday afternoon. But this reconciliation report shows that all but 3 have been resolved. How did that happen? Blake gestured toward Jessica, who'd been standing quietly in the background. Sir, Commander Caldwell identified the discrepancies using the system's audit functions, then coordinated with squadron personnel to trace and physically locate the missing items. The 3 remaining discrepancies are parts that were transferred to other installations, and we have the transfer documentation to prove it. The captain turned his attention to Jessica for the first time. Commander, can you walk me through your methodology? This was exactly the kind of situation Jessica had been trying to avoid: direct interaction with senior officers who might recognize her tactical planning capability as being well above what an admin officer should possess. But there was no avoiding it now. Yes, sir, she said, and began explaining the systematic approach she'd used to identify, prioritize, and resolve the discrepancies. The captain listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he studied her for a long moment. That's a very sophisticated analytical approach, Commander. Particularly for someone whose personnel file indicates an administrative career track with no aviation specialty. Jessica felt everyone's eyes on her. I've had opportunities to work with aviation, logistics in previous billets. Sir. Which billets, specifically? This was dangerous territory. If she named specific assignments, he could verify them. If she was too vague, it would raise even more suspicion. I'd prefer not to go into details while we're in the middle of your inspection, sir, she said carefully. But I'm happy to discuss my background afterward if you'd like. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. We'll table that for now. Let's continue with the physical inventory verification. The inspection team spent the next 3 hours conducting spot checks throughout the warehouse. Every item they selected was exactly where the documentation said it would be. Every serial number matched. Every discrepancy had a clear explanation and supporting records. Finally, around 1,000, the captain called a halt to the warehouse portion of the inspection. Chief Blake, Commander Caldwell, he said formally. I'm prepared to give you a preliminary assessment of this portion of the audit. Everyone tensed. This was the moment that would determine whether days of preparation had been enough. Based on what we've seen today, your aviation supply operations are satisfactory. You had significant discrepancies, but you identified them proactively and took appropriate corrective action. Your documentation is thorough, your corrective measures are sound, and your inventory accuracy is within acceptable parameters. The relief in the room was almost physical. Chief Blake looked like someone had just removed a 1,000-pound weight from his shoulders. However, the captain continued, and the relief evaporated. I have significant questions about how this turnaround was accomplished. Yesterday morning, according to your own records, you had a disaster on your hands. By this morning, everything was resolved. That kind of rapid correction doesn't happen by accident. It requires expertise, leadership, and coordination at a level that frankly I wouldn't expect from an administrative division. He turned his full attention to Jessica. Commander Caldwell, I've been doing these inspections for 8 years. I've seen good supply officers, I've seen great maintenance coordinators, and I've seen a few truly exceptional logisticians. What you accomplished in less than 24 hours puts you in that last category, which makes me very curious about who you really are. Before Jessica could respond, a voice spoke from the warehouse entrance. Captain, may I have a word? Everyone turned to see Master Chief Sullivan standing there, along with Lieutenant Morrison and, surprisingly, Commander Richter, the XO. Richter walked into the warehouse with the measured steps of someone who'd realized something important and was still trying to process it. Captain, I need to brief you on something regarding Commander Caldwell, Richter said. But it needs to be private. The captain looked between Richter and Jessica, clearly sensing that something, significant was happening. Very well. Chief Blake, continue with the inspection team. Commander Caldwell, Commander Richter, you're with me. They moved to a small office at the edge of the warehouse. Once the door was closed, Richter turned to Jessica with an expression that mixed embarrassment and dawning realization. Commander Caldwell, he said slowly, I just received a very interesting phone call from the Chief of Naval Operations Office. Apparently, there's been some concern that a certain flag officer on this base might have had her cover compromised. They wanted to know if we'd noticed anything unusual. Jessica felt her stomach drop. So much for maintaining her anonymity for 4 more days. The inspection captain's eyes went wide. Flag officer? Are you telling me, sir? Jessica said quietly, meeting his gaze directly. My actual rank is Rear Admiral. I've been observing this command for the past 4 days, in advance of assuming command this weekend. The CNO authorized the operation, and only a few people in the chain of command were aware of it. The captain sat down heavily in a chair, looking like someone had just told him the sky was actually green. You're an admiral. Yes, sir. And you've been working in administrative services. As an admin officer. Yes, sir. For 4 days. Yes. Sir. The captain started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that suggested his brain was still trying to catch up with reality. I just gave a preliminary inspection briefing to an admiral, while treating her like a junior officer. You treated me exactly as you should have treated anyone in that position, sir, Jessica said firmly. And your inspection has been thorough and professional. I have no complaints about your conduct. Richter was staring at her with an expression that suggested he was mentally reviewing every interaction they'd had over the past 4 days and realizing how badly the command had screwed up. Ma'am, he said slowly, if you're the incoming CO, that means you've seen everything. Everything. Jessica confirmed. The good, the bad, and the dysfunctional. And you've been taking notes. Very detailed notes, Commander. Richter looked like he might be sick. The inspection captain had recovered his composure somewhat. Admiral, with respect, this is highly irregular. I'm not sure how to proceed with this inspection knowing that you proceed exactly as you would have. Jessica interrupted. Your job is to assess this command's readiness and compliance. My job is to fix whatever you find wrong. Those 2 jobs don't conflict, Captain. In fact, they complement each other perfectly. He nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. I understand. Good. Now, Commander Richter, I need you to do something for me. Anything, ma'am. I need you to keep this information completely quiet for the next 3 days. My change of command ceremony is scheduled for Saturday morning. Until then, I'm still Commander Caldwell, admin officer. After Saturday, I'm Admiral Caldwell, commanding officer. But not before. Is that clear? Ma'am. With respect, the word is going to spread. Master Chief Sullivan knows, Lieutenant Morrison suspects, and now everyone in this warehouse has heard this conversation. Jessica smiled grimly. Then I guess we'll find out how well this command can keep a secret. Won't we, Commander? She turned back to the inspection captain. Sir, I'd appreciate if you'd continue your inspection as planned. I'll be available to support however needed, but I'm not asking for any special treatment or adjustments to your standards." "Understood, Admiral." He stood and extended his hand. "For what it's worth, ma'am, what you've accomplished here in 4 days is remarkable. This command is lucky to have you." "Thank you, Captain. But the real test comes after Saturday, when I actually have to fix all the problems I've identified." As they filed out of the office, Jessica pulled Master Chief Sullivan aside. "Master Chief, I understand you've figured out who I am." Sullivan smiled slightly. "Yes, ma'am. Had a pretty good idea by day 2, confirmed it by day 3. And yet you didn't say anything." "Wasn't my place, Admiral. You were here to do a job, and I wasn't going to interfere with that." She paused. "But I am going to ask you something." "Go ahead. Are you going to fix this place? Really fix it, not just shuffle some paperwork and give some speeches?" Jessica met her eyes squarely. "Master Chief, by the time I'm done here, NAS Oceana is going to be the model for how a naval air station should operate. That's a promise." Sullivan's smile widened. "Then you should know, ma'am, that word's already spreading through the Chief's mess, and we're ready to back you up. Whatever you need, whenever you need it. I'm going to hold you to that, Master Chief. I'm counting on it, Admiral." By the end of day 4, Jessica's cover was effectively blown, at least among those who'd been paying close attention. Word spread through informal networks the way it always did in the military. Chiefs talking to chiefs, sailors sharing stories, officers comparing notes. The official story remained that she was Commander Caldwell, admin officer. But an increasing number of people were starting to suspect that there was much more to the new admin officer than met the eye. And that meant the final 3 days before the change of command ceremony were going to be very interesting indeed. Friday morning, day 5 began with an emergency all-hands meeting that Captain Hendricks had called for 0800. The announcement had come late the previous evening with no explanation, just a terse message that all personnel not on essential watch were to report to the base theater. Jessica arrived early, taking a seat in the back row where she could observe without drawing attention. The theater was a large auditorium that dated back to the 1972, with worn seats and acoustic panels that had seen better days. As personnel filed in, she watched them carefully, noting their body language and attitudes. Most looked tired and vaguely annoyed. Another mandatory meeting to sit through. Another hour of their day consumed by whatever administrative concern had prompted this gathering. Very few showed any enthusiasm or engagement. Captain Hendricks arrived precisely at 0800, moving to the podium with his characteristic air of detached authority. Commander Richter and the other department heads flanked him on the stage, all of them looking uncomfortable for reasons Jessica suspected had little to do with the meeting itself. "Good morning," Hendricks began, his voice amplified by the theater's sound system. "I've called this meeting to address some concerns that have come to my attention regarding readiness and operational standards." Jessica's eyes narrowed. This was interesting. Hendricks rarely acknowledged problems openly, preferring to maintain the fiction that everything was running perfectly under his command. Yesterday's logistics compliance inspection revealed some significant deficiencies in our supply chain management, Hendricks continued. While the inspection team gave us a satisfactory rating overall, they noted that we had numerous discrepancies that required last-minute correction. He paused, letting that sink in. "This is unacceptable. We are a premier naval air station, and we should be operating at a level that doesn't require crisis intervention the night before an inspection." In the back row, Jessica felt a surge of anger. He was blaming his people for problems that stemmed directly from his own failed leadership. The supply chain issues existed because he'd ignored them for months. The last-minute corrections were necessary because he'd provided no support or resources to prevent the problems in the first place. Going forward, Hendricks said, "I expect all departments to maintain higher standards of documentation and accountability. Department heads, you'll be submitting weekly status reports directly to my office. Division officers, You'll be conducting monthly audits of your areas, and all personnel need to remember that readiness is everyone's responsibility. More empty rhetoric. More burden placed on people who were already drowning without any additional support or resources to actually accomplish what he was demanding. Jessica watched as sailors exchanged glances, some resigned, some frustrated, all of them recognizing this for what it was. Leadership passing the blame downward instead of accepting responsibility. Hendricks continued talking for another 20 minutes, outlining new requirements and expectations that would add to everyone's workload without addressing any of the underlying systemic problems. Finally, he opened the floor for questions. The silence was deafening. Nobody wanted to speak up, knowing that any question would likely be interpreted as criticism and marked them as a troublemaker. Jessica made a decision. She'd been planning to stay quiet until the change of command ceremony tomorrow. But watching Hendricks dump responsibility on his people without acknowledging his own failures was too much. She stood up. The movement drew everyone's attention. Heads turned throughout the theater to see who was brave or foolish enough to speak up in this kind of forum. "Yes?" Hendricks said, clearly not recognizing her from the back of the auditorium. "You have a question?" Jessica walked down the aisle toward the front, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent theater. As she got closer, she could see Hendricks's expression shift from mild interest to confusion as he tried to place her. Commander Richter, standing to the side of the stage, had gone pale. He knew what was about to happen. "Sir," Jessica said, her voice carrying clearly through the space. "Commander Caldwell, Administrative Services. I have a question about the new reporting requirements you've outlined." "Go ahead, Commander," Hendricks said, still not understanding that anything unusual was happening. "Sir, you've mandated weekly status reports from department heads, monthly audits from division officers, and increased documentation standards across the command. My question is, what additional resources will you be providing to accomplish these new requirements?" Hendricks frowned. "Resources? We're talking about reporting and documentation, Commander. These don't require additional resources, they require proper attention to detail and commitment to excellence. With respect, sir," Jessica continued, her tone remaining perfectly professional, but carrying an edge that made people sit up straighter. "Reporting and documentation absolutely require resources. They require personnel time, system access, and administrative support, all of which are currently stretched beyond capacity." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Nobody talked to the CO like this. Nobody questioned his directives or pointed out logical flaws in his plans. Hendricks's expression hardened. "Commander, are you suggesting that this command lacks the capability to meet basic readiness standards?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting that this command has been asked to meet those standards without adequate support from leadership, and that adding new requirements without adding resources isn't going to improve readiness. It's going to break the people who are already working around the clock to keep this place functional." The theater was absolutely silent now. Even the department heads on stage were frozen, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch this unprecedented confrontation unfold. Hendricks's face had gone red. "Commander Caldwell, you're out of line. If you have concerns about resource allocation, you address them through your chain of command, not in an open forum. I've been observing this command for 4 days, sir," Jessica said, her voice steady and clear. "And what I've seen is a dedicated group of sailors and officers working themselves to exhaustion while their leadership blames them for problems that stem from systemic failures and inadequate support." "That's enough, Commander. The supply chain discrepancies you mentioned, they exist because maintenance requests go unanswered for months. The evaluation backlog? It exists because admin personnel are drowning in work with no additional bodies to help. The readiness issues? They exist because this command prioritizes appearances over substance and inspection scores over genuine operational capability." Hendricks looked like he was about to explode. "Commander, you will stand down immediately." "No, sir." Jessica's voice cut through the theater like a blade. "I will not stand down. Because someone needs to say what everyone in this room already knows. This command is broken. Not because the sailors aren't dedicated or the officers aren't capable, but because the leadership has failed them. Commander Richter moved toward the podium, trying to intervene before the situation deteriorated further. "Captain, if I might." But Jessica wasn't finished. She'd spent 4 days watching good people suffer under bad leadership, and she was done being silent. "You want to know why the logistics inspection almost failed?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Because Chief Blake and his team have been screaming for help for months, and nobody listened. You want to know why morale is in the basement? Because sailors see their leaders more concerned with their own careers than with the welfare of the people they're supposed to serve." The audience was transfixed. Some looked terrified, others hopeful. All of them shocked that someone was finally saying out loud what they'd been thinking in private. Hendricks had recovered his composure enough to speak, his voice cold and sharp. "Commander Caldwell, you are hereby relieved of your duties, pending a formal investigation into your conduct. Report to the legal office immediately. Security, escort this officer from the theater." 2. Master-at-Arms started moving toward Jessica. But before they could reach her, Master Chief Sullivan stood up from her seat in the 3rd row. "Captain," she said loudly, "before you do that, there's something you should know about Commander Caldwell." Hendricks turned his glare on Sullivan. "Master Chief, this is not the time." "Sir, with respect, this is exactly the time." Sullivan walked down to stand next to Jessica. And then, in a move that shocked everyone in the theater, she came to attention and rendered a sharp salute. Not to Hendricks. To Jessica. "Master Chief, what are you?" Hendricks began. Then Lieutenant Morrison stood up from his seat. He walked down the aisle, positioned himself next to Sullivan, and saluted Jessica as well. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. "You're not looking at Commander Caldwell, Administrative Officer. You're looking at Rear Admiral Jessica Caldwell. Call sign, Reaper. Combat Aviator. Tactical Genius. And as of tomorrow morning, the commanding officer of this base." The theater erupted. Sailors jumped to their feet. Officers snapped to attention. The sound of boots hitting the floor echoed like thunder as hundreds of personnel came to attention simultaneously and rendered salutes. The wave of recognition spread from front to back, each row standing and saluting as the truth crashed over them like a tidal wave. The anonymous admin officer they'd dismissed, ignored, and underestimated for 4 days was actually the flag officer who would command them all. Captain Hendricks stood frozen at the podium, his face cycling through shock, horror, and dawning realization of just how badly he'd miscalculated. Commander Richter stepped forward, his hand rising in a salute that was both an acknowledgement of Jessica's rank and an apology for not protecting her cover better. Jessica stood at the front of the theater, surrounded by hundreds of saluting sailors, and felt the full weight of the moment settle over her shoulders. This wasn't how she'd planned to reveal her identity. She'd wanted to wait for the formal change of command ceremony tomorrow, but perhaps this was better. Perhaps they needed to see that she wasn't some distant flag officer arriving with no understanding of their daily reality. She was someone who'd walked among them, worked beside them, and understood exactly what they were going through. She returned the salute, the gesture encompassing everyone in the theater. "At ease," she said, and her voice carried the unmistakable tone of command authority that no one could mistake for anything other than what it was. The theater settled into stillness, hundreds of sailors standing at attention, waiting to hear what their new commanding officer would say. Jessica turned to face Captain Hendricks. "Captain, thank you for that illuminating demonstration of your leadership philosophy. It's given me exactly the information I needed about what changes will be necessary once I assume command tomorrow." Hendricks had recovered enough to speak, though his voice was strained. "Admiral, I had no idea." "No, you didn't," Jessica agreed. "Because you don't pay attention to the people under your command unless they're important enough to matter to your career. That's going to change. Effective immediately." She turned back to address the full theater. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Rear Admiral Jessica Caldwell. For the past 4 days, I've been working in administrative services, maintenance, coordination, and supply chain management. I've seen this command from the ground level, and I've seen both its strengths and its serious deficiencies. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. What I've seen is a group of dedicated, talented, hard-working sailors and officers who've been failed by their leadership. You've been asked to do more with less, to fix systemic problems with no support, to maintain readiness standards while being denied the resources necessary to meet them. Nods throughout the audience. She was speaking their truth, and they recognized it. That ends now, Jessica continued, her voice firm. As of tomorrow morning, I will be your commanding officer. And I promise you this. I will never ask you to do something without providing you the resources to accomplish it. I will never blame you for problems that stem from leadership failures. And I will never ever treat you as less important than my own career advancement. The theater was absolutely silent, every eye fixed on her. We're going to fix this command together, Jessica said. It won't be easy. It won't be fast. But it will happen. Because you deserve leadership that values your service and respects your dedication. And starting tomorrow, that's exactly what you're going to get. She turned back to Hendricks. Captain, you're relieved as commanding officer, effective immediately. Commander Richter will serve as acting CO until the formal change of command ceremony tomorrow morning at 0900. You'll report to the regional commander's office at 1300 today to discuss your next assignment. Hendricks looked like he wanted to argue, but one look at Jessica's expression and the hundreds of sailors who were clearly on her side convinced him otherwise. He gave a stiff nod and walked off the stage without another word. Jessica watched him go, feeling no satisfaction at his humiliation but profound relief that his toxic leadership would no longer poison this command. She turned back to the assembled personnel. Dismissed. Return to your duties. And for those of you who've been wondering who the hell the new admin officer really was, now you know. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. Then, spontaneously, someone in the back of the theater started clapping. The sound built quickly, growing into sustained applause that echoed off the walls. Jessica stood at attention, accepting the applause not as personal praise but as recognition that change was finally coming. That someone had finally listened to their concerns and validated their experiences. As the theater emptied, Master Chief Sullivan approached her with a broad smile. Well, Admiral, that wasn't exactly how I expected your cover to get blown, but I have to say it was spectacular. Jessica laughed, the tension draining out of her. That's not how I planned it either, Master Chief. But sometimes, you have to adapt to circumstances. Speaking as someone who's been waiting 25 years to see a CO publicly called out for his failures, Sullivan said, I'd say you adapted perfectly. Lieutenant Morrison joined them, still grinning. Admiral, I have to ask, did you plan that whole confrontation? No, Jessica admitted. But I couldn't sit there and watch him blame everyone else for problems he created. These sailors deserved better. They do. Morrison agreed. And now they're going to get it. The rest of Friday passed in a blur of activity. With Hendricks officially relieved and Jessica's true identity revealed, the entire command dynamic shifted dramatically. Sailors who'd been going through the motions suddenly showed energy and initiative. Officers who'd been demoralized started bringing forward ideas they'd been holding back. But there was one more confrontation that needed to happen before Jessica could officially take command. Lieutenant Commander Torres. He'd been conspicuously absent from the all-hands meeting that morning, claiming a scheduling conflict with squadron operations. But Jessica knew avoidance when she saw it. Torres had realized what was happening and was trying to stay below the radar until he figured out how to navigate the new reality. That wasn't going to work. At 1600, Jessica walked into the operations department spaces and asked for Torres's location. She was directed to his office, a small space decorated with plaques, photos, and awards that spoke to a career focused more on personal recognition than on team leadership. She knocked once, and entered without waiting for a response. Torres was at his desk, working on his computer. He looked up as she entered, and she saw the exact moment recognition, and panic crossed his face. He started to stand, but Jessica waved him back down. "Stay seated, Commander. This won't take long." Torres swallowed hard. "Admiral, I want to apologize for which part?" Jessica interrupted, her tone conversational but with an edge that cut. "For the intimidation tactics you used on what you thought was a junior officer? For the condescending tone? For the aggressive invasion of personal space designed to make someone feel threatened?" "All of it, ma'am," Torres said quietly. If you'd known I was an admiral, you would have treated me differently," Jessica finished. "Which is exactly the problem, isn't it? You should treat every person in this Navy with respect and professionalism, regardless of their rank. The fact that you only do so for people you consider important says everything about your leadership philosophy." Torres looked down at his desk, unable to meet her eyes. Jessica continued, her voice calm but relentless. "I watched you bully administrative personnel. I listened to you blame others for systemic problems they didn't create. I saw you use your position to intimidate rather than to lead. And here's what you need to understand. That behavior is over. Not because I'm an admiral, but because it should never have been acceptable in the first place." "Yes, ma'am," Torres said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Here's what's going to happen," Jessica said. "You're going to undergo formal leadership counseling. You're going to complete additional training on professional conduct and proper leadership techniques. And you're going to personally apologize to every single person in administrative services that you've mistreated over the past year." Torres looked up, startled. "Ma'am, I don't even remember everyone." "Then, you'll start with Lieutenant Vance and work through his entire division," Jessica said flatly. "And those apologies will be genuine, not pro forma. Because if I hear that you've simply checked a box without actually changing your behavior, you'll find yourself transferred to a position where your leadership style won't damage anyone else's career or morale." "I understand, Admiral." Jessica studied him for a long moment. She could see the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to figure out how to survive this, how to minimize the damage to his career, how to navigate around the consequences of his actions. That wasn't good enough. "Commander Torres," she said quietly, "I'm going to tell you something that might help you understand why this matters so much. When I was a junior officer, about 23 years ago, I had a department head exactly like you. He was aggressive, intimidating, and convinced that fear was the best motivator. He made my life miserable for 18 months. Torres looked uncomfortable, but he was listening. "One day, we had a crisis equipment failure during a critical evolution. I had the technical knowledge to fix it, but I was so conditioned by his leadership style that I was afraid to speak up. Afraid he'd shoot down my idea, humiliate me in front of others, blame me if it didn't work. So I stayed silent." She paused, letting that sink in. "We lost 6 hours of operational time that day because I was too afraid of my own leader to do my job effectively. And that was when I learned the most important lesson of my career. Bad leadership doesn't just make people miserable. It makes them less effective. It damages the mission." Torres had gone very pale. "You've been doing that to people for years," Jessica said, "making them afraid to speak up, afraid to bring forward ideas, afraid to do anything except the minimum required to stay off your radar. And in doing so, you've degraded this command's effectiveness in ways you'll never fully understand." She stood up to leave, then paused at the door. "You have a choice now, Commander. You can change, really change. Not just pretend to change until the pressure's off and become the kind of leader who brings out the best in people. Or you can stay the same and find yourself finishing your career in positions of decreasing responsibility and influence. Your choice, Admiral," Torres said, and his voice was different now, stripped of arrogance, touched with something that might have been genuine remorse. I don't know if I can change. This is who I've been for a long time. Jessica turned back to face him. Then maybe it's time to become someone different. Someone better. These sailors deserve that. And whether you believe it or not, you deserve that too. She left him sitting there, staring at his desk, full of personal achievements and awards. Perhaps finally understanding that none of them mattered if he destroyed morale and crushed spirits along the way. Saturday morning dawned clear and beautiful. Perfect weather for a change of command ceremony. Jessica arrived at the base at 0700, 2 hours before the official start time, to finalize preparations. The parade ground had been transformed overnight. White chairs arranged in precise rows. A raised platform with a podium. Color guard positioned and ready. The entire base had turned out not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They wanted to see the woman who'd worked beside them, who'd understood their struggles, officially take command. At 0845, the official party began assembling. Regional commanders, local dignitaries, senior officers from surrounding installations, all of them there to witness the ceremony, and Jessica suspected to see for themselves the Admiral who'd spent a week undercover at her own command. At 0855, the Master of Ceremonies called the assembled formation to attention. Ladies and gentlemen, the change of command ceremony for Naval Air Station Oceana will now begin. The naval hymn played, the music carrying across the parade ground and out over the water beyond. Jessica stood at attention, feeling the weight of the moment. This was real now. No more cover, no more observing from the shadows. From this moment forward, she would be responsible for everything that happened at this command. The regional commander stepped to the podium to give the opening remarks. He was a vice admiral named Patterson, a career aviator who'd come up through the ranks alongside Jessica and respected her capabilities. "We are gathered today," Patterson began, "to witness a change of command ceremony with an unusual history. Most incoming commanding officers arrive at their new assignment, spend a week or two getting oriented, and then assume command. Rear Admiral Caldwell chose a different path." He smiled slightly. She arrived a week ago and spent her first 4 days working undercover as an administrative officer, experiencing this command from the ground level. She filed paperwork, coordinated logistics, resolved supply discrepancies, and worked alongside sailors at every level of this organization. Murmurs of approval from the formation. "Some might call that unorthodox," Patterson continued. "I call it brilliant, because Admiral Caldwell now understands this command in a way that no traditional turnover could have provided. She knows the people, the problems, and the potential. And based on what I've heard over the past 24 hours, this command is about to undergo a transformation." He turned to Jessica. "Admiral Caldwell, are you ready to assume command of Naval Air Station Oceana?" "I am, sir," Jessica replied, her voice clear and strong. "Then step forward and take your place." Jessica marched to the podium as the official orders were read aloud. The formal transfer of authority from Captain Hendricks, represented in absentia by his signed orders, to Rear Admiral Jessica Caldwell. When the reading concluded, she turned to face the formation. Hundreds of sailors in dress uniforms, standing at attention, waiting to hear from their new commanding officer. "Officers and sailors of Naval Air Station Oceana," she began. "A week ago, I walked through your gates as Commander Caldwell, anonymous admin officer. Today, I stand before you as your commanding officer, but in a very real sense, nothing has changed. I'm still the same person who worked beside you, who listened to your concerns, who saw both your strengths and your challenges." She paused, making eye contact with individuals throughout the formation. "I've seen what this command is capable of. I've watched sailors work through the night to resolve critical problems. I've seen officers find creative solutions to impossible situations. I've witnessed dedication, competence, and professionalism at every level." Her voice grew stronger. "I've also seen systemic dysfunction, inadequate support, and leadership failures that have prevented you from reaching your full potential. That ends today. The formation remained at attention. But Jessica could feel the energy shift hope, replacing resignation. Here's what I promise you, she continued. I promise to listen when you identify problems. I promise to provide resources when you need support. I promise to defend you when you're right and correct you when you're wrong. And I promise that this command will become known throughout the fleet not for our inspection scores or our polish, but for our genuine operational excellence and our treatment of every person with dignity and respect. She let that settle for a moment, then continued. But I'm also going to ask things of you. I'm going to ask you to bring me your ideas, even when they challenge the status quo. I'm going to ask you to hold yourselves and each other to the highest standards, not because someone's watching, but because it's who we are. And I'm going to ask you to believe that things can be better because they can, and they will. Jessica looked across the formation one more time. Together, we're going to transform this command into something extraordinary. Not overnight, not without effort, but steadily and surely. Because you deserve leadership that matches your dedication. And starting today, that's exactly what you have. She came to attention. I am honored to be your commanding officer. Let's get to work. The ceremony concluded with the formal passing of the organizational flag and the retirement of Captain Hendrix's personal colors. Then, as Jessica turned from the podium, something unexpected happened. Chief Warrant Officer Blake stepped forward from the formation. Without a word, he came to attention and rendered the sharpest salute Jessica had ever seen. It wasn't a ceremonial salute. It was personal. It was thanks for the night she'd spent helping him resolve the inventory crisis, for treating him with respect, for actually listening. Then Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward and saluted. Then Master Chief Sullivan. Then Lieutenant Vance. One by one, sailors and officers stepped out of formation to render personal salutes to their new commanding officer. Not because protocol required it, but because they wanted to. Because she'd earned it. The trickle became a flood. Within minutes, the entire formation had dissolved into hundreds of individual sailors, each one stepping forward to salute and then return to their place. The sound was extraordinary, boots on asphalt, fabric rustling, breath held and released. A symphony of respect, freely given. Jessica returned each salute individually, making eye contact, acknowledging each person's service. Her arm began to ache after the first 100, but she didn't care. This was what leadership meant. Not the ceremony, not the rank, but this connection between commander and commanded. When the last salute had been rendered and returned, silence fell over the parade ground. Vice Admiral Patterson stepped up beside Jessica, his own eyes slightly damp. In 30 years of naval service, he said quietly, I have never seen anything like that. Neither have I, sir, Jessica replied, her voice thick with emotion. Take care of them, Admiral. That's the plan, sir. 6 months later, Naval Air Station Oceana barely resembled the place Jessica had first observed from behind her undercover disguise. The changes had started small. Within the first week, Jessica had reorganized the administrative structure to better support operations rather than creating obstacles. She'd implemented new communication channels that allowed problems to be identified and addressed quickly. And she'd made herself visible and accessible in a way that Hendrix never had. But the real transformation came from empowering the people who'd been there all along. Lieutenant Vance, promoted to lieutenant commander, now led a completely restructured administrative division. The backlog of evaluations had been eliminated. The supply chain functioned smoothly. And more importantly, the division had become known throughout the region as a model for how admin services should support operational commands. Chief Warrant Officer Blake oversaw an aviation supply system that was now cited as the gold standard for inventory management and maintenance support. His warehouse teams had been recognized with multiple awards, and other installations regularly sent personnel to learn from his processes. Lieutenant Morrison had been promoted and given command of his own squadron, but he still made time to stop by Jessica's office regularly to discuss leadership philosophy and tactical planning. Master Chief Sullivan had become Jessica's senior enlisted advisor and most trusted confidant. Together, they'd rebuilt the command climate from the ground up, creating an environment where excellence was expected, but mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than career-ending disasters. Even Lieutenant Commander Torres had shown genuine change. After months of counseling, training, and personal work, he'd begun to develop real leadership skills. He'd never be the warmest personality in the Navy, but he'd learned to treat people with respect and to lead through inspiration rather than intimidation. Jessica had recently recommended him for promotion and a new assignment where he could continue growing. The physical changes to the base were visible too. Administrative buildings had been repainted. Equipment had been upgraded. Facilities that had been neglected for years were now properly maintained. But these physical improvements were merely reflections of the deeper cultural transformation. Morale had skyrocketed. Retention rates had improved dramatically. And when sailors talked about NAS Oceana, they did so with pride rather than resignation. The change had been noticed at higher levels of command as well. NAS Oceana had become the preferred assignment for talented personnel who wanted to serve in a command that valued their contributions. Inspection scores had improved across every category. Not because people were gaming the system, but because genuine operational excellence naturally led to inspection success. One evening in late fall, Jessica stood on the flight line watching the sun set over the water. 18 seconds were secured for the night, their maintenance crews completing final checks before heading home. The sounds of the base settling into evening watch were familiar and comforting. Master Chief Sullivan joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She passed one to Jessica without comment. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sky turn colors. "You know what's different now, Admiral?" Sullivan said finally. "What's that, Master Chief?" People smile. Sounds simple, but 6 months ago, you'd walk through this base and see tight faces, shoulders hunched, people just trying to get through the day. Now, people smile. They joke. They enjoy coming to work. Jessica nodded. That was always the goal. Not to create some kind of perfect command where nothing ever goes wrong, but to create a place where people feel valued and supported. Mission accomplished, ma'am. They finished their coffee as the last light faded from the sky. Then Sullivan asked the question she'd been holding on to for months. "Admiral, would you do it again, the undercover week?" Jessica considered. "In a heartbeat, Master Chief. Because those 4 days taught me more about this command than any official brief ever could. I saw the real challenges, the real heroes, the real problems that needed fixing. And I understood that the people doing the hardest work were often the ones least visible to leadership. A lot of COs wouldn't have done that," Sullivan observed. "Most would have shown up, assumed command, and started making changes based on their preconceptions. And most of those changes would have been wrong," Jessica replied. "Because they wouldn't have been based on reality, they'd have been based on what leadership thought was happening, which is often very different from what's actually happening." Sullivan smiled. "Well, for what it's worth, ma'am, I'm glad you did it, because you earned our respect before you ever put on your stars. And that made all the difference. The respect goes both ways, Master Chief. You and the others kept this place running through terrible leadership. You protected the mission and your people when no one else would. That takes real courage. Just doing our jobs, Admiral." "No," Jessica said firmly. "You went far beyond your jobs. You stayed when you could have transferred. You kept faith when you had every reason to give up. You maintained standards when the easy path would have been to just coast until retirement. That's not just doing your job, that's exemplifying the best of what the Navy is supposed to be." Sullivan looked embarrassed by the praise but also quietly pleased. "Thank you, ma'am." They walked back toward the headquarters building together, passing sailors who greeted them with genuine warmth rather than nervous formality. This was what Jessica had fought for her entire career. Not rank or recognition, but the chance to create environments where people could be their best selves. Where dedication was rewarded, excellence was expected, and every person mattered regardless of their position. She'd commanded carrier strike groups and made tactical decisions affecting thousands of personnel. But somehow, this felt more important, more personal, more real. Because she'd walked among these sailors before commanding them. She'd seen them at their best and witnessed the obstacles they faced. And that understanding had made her not just their commander, but their advocate and their champion. The following week, Jessica was in her office reviewing readiness reports when her phone buzzed with an incoming call from the Chief of Naval Operations. "Admiral Caldwell," she answered. "Jessica, it's Tom." Vice Admiral Thomas Bradford, the CNO, sounded pleased. "I wanted to call personally to tell you that your command has been selected as the fleet-wide model for administrative excellence and leadership culture." "That's quite an honor, sir. But the credit belongs to the sailors and officers here. They did the real work." "They did the work," Bradford agreed. "But you created the environment that allowed them to excel. And that's not a common skill. Which is why I'm calling with a question." Jessica felt a small flutter of concern. "Sir? We have 3 other major installations that are experiencing the same kinds of dysfunction you found at Oceana. Similar command climate issues, similar morale problems, similar disconnects between leadership and execution. I'd like your permission to use your undercover observation method at those commands as well." Jessica considered carefully. "Sir, the approach worked at Oceana because the context was right, but it's not a universal solution. Each command is different, and what worked here might not work elsewhere." "I understand that," Bradford said. "But the core principal leaders, experiencing their commands from the ground level before assuming authority, that principle has value regardless of the specific situation." "What do you think?" "I think it has merit, sir," Jessica admitted. "But it requires the right kind of leader. Someone who can set aside ego, genuinely listen, and be willing to challenge their own assumptions. Not everyone can do that." "Then help me identify officers who can," Bradford said. "Because what you've accomplished at Oceana is proof that transformation is possible. That even deeply dysfunctional commands can be turned around with the right leadership approach, and the Navy needs more of that." Jessica thought about the changes she'd seen over the past 6 months. The sailors who'd rediscovered their pride. The officers who'd learned that leadership meant service, not authority. The entire command culture that had shifted from resigned mediocrity to engaged excellence. "I'll help however I can, sir," she said. "Good. Because leaders like you, leaders who genuinely understand that their job is to serve the people they command, are exactly what we need." After the call ended, Jessica sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the journey from that first day, walking through the gate as an anonymous admin officer to this moment as a commanding officer whose methods were being considered for fleet-wide implementation. It hadn't been about deception or gotcha moments. It had been about understanding, about seeing the reality rather than the carefully curated version presented to leadership, about recognizing that the people doing the hardest work often had the least voice, and about proving that real leadership meant walking among your people, listening to their concerns, and fighting for them even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. That evening, Jessica attended a promotion ceremony in the base theater, the same theater where she'd publicly confronted Captain Hendricks 6 months earlier. But now, the space felt different. The energy was different. The people were different. Or maybe they weren't different at all. Maybe they'd always had this potential, this capability, this dedication. They just needed leadership that believed in them and created space for them to excel. As she pinned new rank insignia on a petty officer who'd shown exceptional leadership, Jessica caught Master Chief Sullivan's eye across the room. Sullivan smiled and gave her a subtle nod. They both knew what that smile meant. It meant they'd done it. They'd taken a broken command and made it whole. They'd taken demoralized sailors and reminded them why they'd chosen to serve. They'd taken a dysfunctional system and proven that change was possible. The ceremony concluded with the traditional reception line. As Jessica shook hands and offered congratulations, she listened to the conversations around her. People talking about upcoming deployments with excitement rather than dread. officers discussing innovative solutions to operational challenges, sailors making plans for training programs and advancement opportunities. This was what healthy command culture sounded like. And it had all started with one decision: to set aside rank and authority for a week, to experience the command as it really was, and to let that understanding inform every decision that followed. As Jessica drove home that evening, she thought about the guard at the gate who'd waved her through without a second glance on that first morning. About Lieutenant Vance, overwhelmed by a backlog he couldn't fix alone. About Chief Blake facing an inspection disaster with no support. About Master Chief Sullivan who'd recognized real leadership beneath the disguise. All of them had taught her something important. All of them had contributed to the transformation. And all of them proved what she'd always believed: that every person in the Navy, regardless of rank or position, had value and deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. That was the real lesson of her undercover week. Not that she was some brilliant commander who swooped in to save the day, but that leadership was fundamentally about service, about listening more than talking, about empowering rather than controlling, about creating environments where people could be their best selves. She'd worn Admiral stars for years before coming to Oceana, but she'd learned more about real leadership in 4 days as an anonymous admin officer than in some of her previous assignments combined. Because when you stripped away the rank, the ceremony, and the trappings of authority, what remained was the essence of what leadership should be: one person helping others succeed, grow, and find meaning in their service. That was the promise she'd made to herself 23 years ago, when a toxic department head had taught her what leadership should never be. And that was the promise she renewed every day as she walked among her sailors, listened to their concerns, and fought for them with every tool at her disposal. Real power wasn't in medals or rank. It was in knowing the truth before anyone could hide it. It was in understanding your people deeply enough to lead them effectively. And it was in recognizing that the greatest honor in military service wasn't commanding others, it was serving alongside them. Rear Admiral Jessica Caldwell, callsign Reaper, had proven that truth in the most direct way possible. And Naval Air Station Oceana would never be the same. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us, where are you watching from, and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget.